And I will do the same on mine as a backup, as is welcome, as anyone else is welcome to do. There we go. All right. Building on the background of what we did in the first two sessions, we're now getting into these main sections of the course syllabus. And this is week 2, globalization, mostly economics, technology, hierarchy. These 3 big concepts we're looking at. And then I'll mention now what I sent out in case, just as a reminder, if you missed it or for new people just joining the course. We're changing the week 3 and we're moving it down, and we're inserting for week 3 the section called new social movements and so forth. It's now basically week 8 on the older syllabus, but if you get the syllabus that's labeled V2 or anything, if we revise it V3 or V4, it will have next week. And so when you're thinking about what to do this week or on the weekend, please try to take a look at the readings for the new social movement section. But I'll hint that we're going to suggest that a lot of these ideas about new social movements are critical for what's happening in the Capitol with the protests with Trump, in the streets of Kiev, in Hong Kong, in Cairo, when the president of the country, as well as in Kiev, in those 2 countries, the presidents resigned after about a week of protest. Why and how was that so different from the Washington, D.C.? Or why is Syria so different? Instead we have civil war going on for years. So in some places, a little bit of social protest has huge political consequences, what's called discreetly regime change, which means the whole president of the country leaves and says, okay, take over, do what you want. So when people are seeing that kind of thing happening on the web, on their phones, in many countries of the world, is the US impervious to that? That's the kind of question we want to ask, and not ask or try to answer only in terms of what did the Constitution say, or what is the follow-up on that in the legal tradition of the US and England is called precedent, that history is the iron law that holds us in where we are. And it may be that not everybody knows that, especially younger people who grow up with television, cell phones, social media, chats, FaceTime, Facebook, and that is critically important for them. Okay, that's the kind of thing we're going to talk about next week. So think about that and how that feeds into and then connects with alternative views of how we interpret globalization and how it drives what we're doing. Okay, so the second big point is beyond the sections of the course, and we're now in the section on markets, is how and why does globalization work internationally? So we can think of globalization or something within the sections of the course. For instance, we have political culture, we have sections on civic activities, and so forth. Those are pretty clear. When we deal with globalization more abstractly, that's a much more loose, ambiguous concept, and it's been defined in multiple ways. The main way it was defined through, let's say, much of the 20th century was from Lenin. Marx did not say much. Marx sort of left it in a loose way. Lenin picked up on that, and he wrote a couple of essays in more detail. And he basically said, as long as capitalism is alive anywhere in the world, we've got to fight it because they will kill us if we don't kill them first. So basically that perspective on globalization was in a sense a background political question, But in fact, the driver was seen as a Marxist image of the economy, of markets, of capitalism and investments, managers, corporations. These were the drivers in the image. First in Lenin, and then this was picked up probably more importantly after Lenin. At the urban level, people like Manuel Castells wrote a book on basically Marxism in the city when he was then in Paris. And then there were a few British Marxists who were close to following, tried to follow basically a Lenin Wall Street economic image that this was globalization, and it was sort of bad capitalism. All right. John Friedman at University of UCLA in the, I think he was in the urban studies and architecture department. He's a Latin American specialist. The views that I've been discussing were discussed a fair amount in Latin America, and he was close to them, and he basically articulated this, and this continues today with the simple term of neoliberalism. In a sense, it doesn't say what neoliberalism is, but it's a slogan which is somehow operating. And the Latin Americans and the East Europeans have used it a lot, as have some people in the US, but not really very seriously. Okay, these folded into the background of a lot of discussion about this. But let me so in a sense, I'm starting with the 20th century. Then we're going to flash back, but let me just come up to Saskia Sassen, and then flash back. Saskia Sassen had a lot of impact among academics and some policy folks, but what she did, and others like Thomas Friedman, not John, Thomas, was to pull together these sort of globalizing ideas, but not follow a simple Marxist approach, not just call it Wall Street. And we'll go over Saskia Sassen's in a little more detail in a minute or two, but I'm making that general point. One anecdote, when she came to the University of Chicago for 10 years or something like that, and I taught several courses where we had a lot of students who worked together. And one story she told was that she was with a friend in Manhattan, and there was a copy of a book sitting on the coffee table called "The World is Flat" by Thomas Friedman. And Saskia's friend said, "You know, you heard about this idea of globalization? It's pretty interesting." So her close friend, and Saskia had 5 years or so before that, published a book which she thought was everybody was reading, but no. Thomas Friedman really made the concept popular. This was a bestseller on the New York Times book reading list for a long time. And so we want to let him have a word or two right after Adam Smith. It's okay, as he's clearly first on the list. And we've got a number of you who are majors in economics. And so I'll ask you, what is the not four-letter, four-word perspective of Adam Smith about globalization? What is globalization in Adam Smith? Okay, if we don't get an immediate answer to that, my follow-up is, what's the core point of the whole book? The wealth of nations. He's basically saying the wealth of nations is something we need to understand why it emerges and what can we do to build up the wealth of nations, and where does it come from? Okay. Any economic majors who want to comment on what's the key driver of wealth, of how and why does wealth increase, and what are the one or two big things that Adam Smith stresses? And let me add, if you're not an economics major, this is part, as people have said, of general culture, general education, and social theory. That is, you can't understand a lot of what's going on around the world without at least a sense of this. And if you only read the summary of that from Marx and Lenin, you don't quite get the same picture. But you do get a picture what some people have smiled and said, well, that's what they do in Russia. I mean, that they know what capitalism is in Russia. They've read Marx. Okay, it ain't quite the same. So as we say at the USC, try to read a little bit of the original sources. Okay, so either if you've had this in a gen ed course, or if you're an economics major, you ought to be able to answer 2 or 3 things very simply. And I haven't heard a word yet. Two hands are up. Gustavo.
If I remember correctly, a key thing is that he broke with the current tradition at the time, the physiocrats, and proposed that labor was a source of wealth. And then the next step was saying that labor specialization and division of labor was ultimately able to increase the general output of society.
Okay, I mean, I'd say your second answer is the key point. It's the division of labor was clearly the key driver that Smith stressed. However, how and why might the division? So if we say, if we're looking for, or let's we have a hand up from Katie. Katie, do you want to? Can you turn your video on and then add anything to that? You're muted. Just click on unmute. Good.
I was going to say, as part of the division of labor, he stressed that it was important because it allowed for specialization in different aspects. So, for example, like he described like pin making. So you could say like that one person was in charge of making the head of the pin, and one person was in charge of making the rest of the pin, and then some person was in charge of putting it together. So it allowed for specialization and more efficiency.
Okay, exactly. I mean, that these are probably the two critical points which you all should remember as part of your general education, even if you're in art history or whatever else. Division of labor and specialization comes from the division of labor, and because you have people not being only specialists, but they get better and better and better as we get more and more and more division of labor, then you can have higher quality. Why do we have, nevertheless, so okay, so if these are, if we think of let me mention even now, lower on a reading list for this week is to take a look at a couple of things which are valuable just for sharpening your abilities to present stuff clearly. And I have 2 readings by Blaylock and Stinchcomb, guys who are sort of good at drawing simple boxes and arrows. So the idea, that is, if we were in economics, they would say write equations, and that would work for some of you, but if you're in art history, you're probably not used to writing equations. So if instead, the simple view is make some boxes like division of labor leads to specialization, specialization leads to the wealth of nations, more wealth for everybody. I mean, that's the simple kind of idea that X leads to Y leads to Z. Okay. Take a look at, even that is, before you read anything, just scan through the pictures of the Blaylock and Stinchcomb reading and get an idea of say 5 or 6 different ways that you can make some little boxes and arrows, which are very simple to do. But think about ways when you're reading Adam Smith or Thomas Friedman, what are the boxes and arrows that they have in their heads, or they're telling us that they're telling us to pay attention to. That's what I'm trying to do now. So I'm saying we have Adam Smith, X leads to Y leads to Z, but I'm then asking, what does he say in his terms about why this whole process of X leads to Y leads to Z could go further and faster? That is, it's the context around the X and the Y and the Z that I'm getting at. What are the kinds of things that he discusses, either making it go further, the division of labor goes further, and some countries have more wealth, others have less. And he criticizes, as we've heard in Washington in the last 4 years and for centuries before, some things which make for less wealth. And to keep it focused. This is where I'm asking for you for the 4 words that you should remember from Adam Smith's chapter 1. Or this chapter, I think it's, chapters, pages, first 10, 20 pages. And it links directly to the title of this course, globalization. What is his word in a sense for globalization, or his phrase? Mylan Patton.
Sorry,
Just a little bit louder. We can't quite hear you.
Sorry, I was going against globalization.
You're not loud enough for some reason. Yeah, just maybe get closer to your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Barely, still low, but oh yes, we can hear, but that's better.
Sorry, I was going against globalization, but I have to look at my notes for the term, so I'm gonna lower my hand.
Yeah, I mean, we use globalization. Friedman, Boschkin, Saskia Suss, we're all talking about it today, but the term Adam Smith did not in that way. Smith's term, and I'll give you the answer, but I'm pointing to you, the rest of you who ought to be able to have raised your hand with this, and the answer is the extent of the market. The extent of the market. Okay, what's that relate to in other things that he does discuss? Why do you have a greater extent of the market, which makes this division of labor work faster and further? What prevents the extent of the market from being bigger or growing? And that this is one of the major things that Adam Smith criticizes. Politics. What about politics specifically? What policy? Many of you are public policy majors. What's the specific policy that follows from this, which prevents the division of labor, prevents globalization, and reduces wealth, according to Smith? Okay, that you all should, I mean, everybody should have this at least at the tip of their tongue, and everybody should know this amount of Adam Smith, even if you don't know what's after page 15. This is part of even if you're Chinese, you ought to know this. Okay. The answer is tariffs. If you have taxes that say if you buy this from China in the US, you will pay a tariff of 30% more. This is what Donald Trump has been fighting over with the Chinese for 4 years. He's been saying, if you have tariffs on some of our goods, we're going to raise tariffs on your goods. They're fighting back and forth. They're negotiating back, etc., on how much will you charge as a tariff. And why are they arguing? Because if the extent of the market, if you can sell 50% more of your products, you can make more money, and all of China or all of the US, that is, but okay, is it one way? No. Quick follow-up. If the Chinese are selling low-cost televisions, low-cost cars, low-cost toasters, low-cost Apple computers, which are mostly made in China, they sell these to the Americans and to the Europeans and to the others. What do the Chinese sell to the Asians more generally? The Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Taiwanese. What do all those people really want from America most of all? Food. China has a huge food deficit. The Chinese population would starve in weeks if it didn't have huge amounts of food being imported. So the Chinese feel very dependent on food. And we have, I'll mention briefly, we have a great thing we may bring in about sister potato. That is, they're trying to get the Chinese to eat potatoes because it's cheaper to grow potatoes than rice. Rice is a very expensive commodity to, okay. So another thing that Chinese bring in terms of trading back and forth and tariffs, and think about capital gains and taxes and stuff like that is, so if what's financing the problem, all these solutions, problems, and new projects in the last year, and the huge new projects being discussed by President Joe Biden? Borrowing more money. They're not going to raise taxes. They're going to provide lots more services and give people lots more money. And Trump has done this massively, linked with COVID, but not just with COVID, with many of the other programs. Who gives the cash when you borrow? You borrow from whom? The Chinese. The Chinese government is the largest buyer of US Treasury bills in the world and has been for much of the last, so that the Chinese are the capitalists. The Chinese are the capitalists of the US government and funding its activities. Okay, ironic additions to the simple-minded rhetorical labeling that we have. Okay, but key points: extent of the market, division of labor, increased wealth, and these are, of course, or just briefly to flash forward, the classic left and right said, I shouldn't say too long classic. This is so-called in the English tradition, the Manchester liberal version of English Manchester liberalism was low tariffs following Adam Smith, basically. And that has become, in the 20th century, the Republican tradition of the right. The right, especially defined, heightened, and implemented. Let me catch myself. Implemented rhetorically, the opposite was implemented by both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who talked about cutting tariffs and increasing trade, but actually, in part because they had majorities or others around them, they didn't just have their own governments. But under their leadership, that didn't really happen. But the world began talking in terms of free trade and lowering tariffs more than it had for years before. But the interesting then reversal with Trump has been, but he wasn't unique. But I'm making the point that this has been a battleground among the conservative parties in Europe, and especially now with the Republicans here, is should the Republican Party decrease taxes and government spending? Okay, Trump has not really done that, and so in different ways, I'm pointing out that the classic linkage of the economy with the political system of, as Adam Smith talked about, that the proper, in a sense, that what I spoke of as Manchester liberalism was basically the policy implementation of Adam Smith's programs into the 19th and 20th century policies of the world. Okay. All right, if this is the background, let's just give a couple of minutes to Thomas Friedman, as if we can. Is it easy for one of you to play that, please? We'll start and he's going to give us a quick summary of some of the background, little bits of the world is flat. Well, it's okay. Here we go. Is there a way to make this volume higher? We don't hear anything. No volume.
You should mute it.
Am I the only one that has it, for whom this is mute?
We can't hear anything, Professor.
Okay, so we don't know what the problem is. All right, so we'll skip. If you want to play with it, go ahead a little bit. Now I'll talk a little bit about Thomas Friedman. Friedman is an editorial page writer for the New York Times on foreign affairs, and he did a couple of books right on the same topic. This was the earlier one called The Lexus and the Olive Tree. And he covered the Middle East. He was in the Middle East for a number of years, writing for the New York Times on sort of the economics and markets of Israel, the Middle Eastern countries, and the idea of the olive tree comes especially from Middle Eastern countries and from Mediterranean countries, Italy, Spain, where they would grow olive trees, and you would think in terms of olives and listening. I don't hear anything. Does anybody else?
Great era.
Okay, here we go.
The first I call globalization 1.0. It lasted from 1492 till the early 1800s, the beginning of real global trade and arbitrage. That era of globalization 1.0 shrunk the world from a size large to a size medium. And what characterized that first era of globalization was that you went global through your country. That is, the main agent of globalization was the nation state. Nation states globalizing for empire or for resources or for power. It was Britain colonizing India, France, parts of Africa, Spain, the Americas. Globalization 2.0 began in the early 1800s, and core thesis is that there have been three great era of globalization. The first I call globalization 1.0. It lasted from 1492 till the early 1800s, the beginning of real global trade and arbitrage. That era of globalization 1.0 shrunk the world from a size large to a size medium. And what characterized that first era of globalization was that you went global through your country. That is, the main agent of globalization was the nation state. Nation states globalizing for empire or for resources or for power. It was Britain colonizing India, France, parts of Africa, Spain, the Americas. Globalization 2.0 began in the early 1800s and ended really right around the year 2000. It shrunk the world from a size medium to a size small. And that era of globalization was spearheaded by companies globalizing for markets and for labor and for resources. In that era of globalization, you went global through your company, the Dutch East India Company. The company was the agent of globalization. Well, while you were sleeping, or at least while I was sleeping, we entered globalization 3.0 from the year 2000 to the present. And it's shrinking the world from a size small to a size tiny and leveling the global economic playing field at the same time. And what's really cool, really exciting, and really terrifying about this era of globalization is that it's not built around countries, although they're still important. And it's not built around companies, although they're still important. No, what's really new, really different, really exciting, and really terrifying about this era of globalization is that it's built around individuals. What is really new about this era is that we now have a world where individuals can compete, connect, and collaborate globally as individuals. So we've gone from a world where globalization was driven by countries to one driven by companies to one now spearheaded by individuals. That's what characterizes this era. That's what's really new. Sometimes people say to me, oh, Friedman, you exaggerate. We've been through globalization eras before. There was more world trade before World War I. This isn't just about trade. This is about a fact. When I was working on my book, I called my mother back in Minneapolis. She was 80 at the time. I got her on the phone. She said I was disturbing her. I said, why, Mom? She said, I'm playing bridge with someone on the internet in Siberia. Please call back later. Okay. Was anybody's grandmother here playing bridge on the internet with someone in Siberia in 1913? I don't think so. No, this era is very, very new. Now, excuse me 1 second. What I'd like to talk about next is how do we get here? And that's really about this globalization platform. And let me kind of reduce it to its real core. In the book, I talk about 10 flatteners that really created this world where individuals could be so empowered. But for the purposes of this lecture, let me just focus on the first 4 flatteners because they're really the key. So the first flattener was the PC, the invention of the PC, the personal computer. Why was the PC so important? The PC was such a huge flattener because what it allowed was for individuals, that's where it all starts, it allowed for individuals, for the first time in history, to author their own content. Words, music, data, video, spreadsheets, to author their own content in digital form. Now, individuals have been authoring their own content ever since cave women and cavemen etched on cave walls. But with the PC, suddenly we as individuals, now it's morphing into the iPhone. We as individuals can create our own content in digital form, in the form of bits and bytes, whether it's words, photo, data, music, video, spreadsheets, in the form of digital content, in the form of bits and bytes. That was the first flattener, and you'll understand why it was important when you hear about the second flattener. Second flattener is really a date. I consider this date actually next to 11/9, which is the day the Berlin Wall came down. Next to November 9th, 1989. I consider this date the most important day in your life, in my life. This date was 8/9/95, August 9th, 1995. Because on that date, August 9th, 1995, a little startup company in Mountain View, California, called Netscape went public. And the day Netscape went public changed the world forever for 2 reasons. The first was Netscape's invention. What was Netscape's invention? It was a...
Okay, what if we put our heads together and think for a minute? He mentioned 10 flatteners. How many can we come up with in discussing? And if you want to draw on reading anything else that you've been looking at, fine. But you can use things which you hear the flavor of what he's talking about, and it's couched at a level that everybody can pretty immediately identify with. And let's see if we can list 5 more, and then whether if they match his, fine. If they don't, maybe they're better than his, or they may be later than his. Anybody want to suggest a few examples? IDVJ?
Yeah, I think offshoring probably because it's similar to the idea of division of labor, right? You're basically offshoring a cheaper labor in other countries, taking advantage of that, and that's flattening the world to an extent.
Okay, yes, I mean, that's probably that existed substantially before the period he's talking about. That is, but for sure, it was enhanced by everything that he's discussing. So in a sense, it's implementation of globalization through it's the division of labor, reducing prices, but so in that sense, you're getting at the bigger idea. He often talked about, but I won't, I mean, in a sense, you've put your finger on it just as well as he did. Okay, Andrew, what you have in mind?
Well, at the end, he discussed 2 more recent phenomenons. So the fall of the Berlin Wall and its symbolic end of these large communist, essentially planned economies. And then he also mentioned Netscape, which kind of represents the internet becoming a big part of people's lives.
Okay, I mean, absolutely. Those are two huge ones. And as he said, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I would put the date of the founding of Netscape. Nathan Alexander?
Yeah, as far as like a flattener.
Can you turn on your video?
Oh yeah, hold on.
Are you?
How's it going?
Go ahead.
As far as like a more recent flattener, just like social media as a part of the internet. So you have like MySpace, Facebook, Twitter.
Okay, absolutely. For sure. These are huge, very specific follow-ups, and they've grown a lot more since he wrote the book. And they affect many, many people today in ways that his mother playing cards with someone in Siberia illustrates that point. But there are millions and hundreds of millions of people using social media more actively than was true then. So these are all good suggestions. How about 1 or 2 more? You're mute, Gustavo.
Okay, not sure if that's in the range, but it really came to my mind the Bretton Woods Agreement that after the World War II or at the end of the World War II kind of put the dollar as the standard for international commerce and finance. Also created the International Monetary Fund.
Okay, yes. I mean, so two kinds of things. In a sense, the monetary institutions, World Bank and so forth, that made it easier to have a common currency and to trade for sure. And then the related institutions, banks, central banks, world banks, played a much more global role than they had in earlier years. So yes, and that's a good point. It's good. I mean, what you're bringing in nicely, I would say, from your general knowledge, you're bringing in some things which really precede the things which Thomas Friedman talked about. But let me not elaborate that yet. But that is, yeah. Go ahead. Let's see if we can have 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about like computer software in general, as like in the sense that, you know, a lot of companies can you know, provide services without even needing humans anymore to like punch in numbers. Yeah.
Absolutely. So in the sense of automation, technological advancement, sophisticated use of computers linked with production lines, for sure. That's very, very important.
Yeah.
And again, it's a powerful example because it didn't happen after Netscape. This went back, it has roots much older, but in a sense you could say it's Henry Ford. It's the production line, the idea of having a more and more technically advanced production line and then adding more electronics, IBM and so forth. So this happened through the 20th century. People talked about Fordism, and that was not after the PC in the way that he stresses. On the other hand, Henry Ford was not so much global as he was more national, but certainly these were steps in the same direction. Okay, so congratulations. I would say what you've added are all very good points. I would say implicitly what you are showing is some of the weaknesses of Friedman. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both his strengths and his weaknesses as he's been so influential, and many people are following, thinking, talking in terms which are closer to Friedman than I would say than your points have been. Point one, he's anti-science, anti-theory, anti-explicit interpretation. He's not a social scientist, he's a journalist. And he goes much further than that. He's very smart. He writes very powerful books, but they are basically, so if that's the negative, and we can come back. The positive is he writes, as do many journalists, stories, like his grandmother was playing bridge with someone in Siberia. That's powerful. You remember that. Or he then has terms or examples. Instead of talking about here's X leads to Y leads to Z, which is too abstract, he talks about globalization 1.0, 2.0. It went from size large to size medium. Okay. Everybody can understand that and resonate with that, but it doesn't tell you why and how it happened. And if you cite, as you've already heard me say, if you cite any one factor like the invention of the PC, it's inevitably wrong. That is, everything that all of you have mentioned also were going on simultaneously, or in many of your examples, before the invention of the PC. So in that sense, because this is such a multi-causal, complicated thing, I'm not trying to say, here's how far wrong he was and how right you are, but I'm simply saying, if you say there is no theory, and then you say, well, there's globalization 1, globalization 2, globalization, and then you invoke these terms like the golden straitjacket, that's one of the most important. His term, the golden straitjacket, in a sense is taking the Adam Smith idea that you're golden, you can make more money, but you have to wear it as a straight jacket around your chest. And if you go outside and try to break out of that straitjacket, you're going to destroy the system. Okay, what's the system that he's talking about? He has in mind something like the ideals of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. He's talking about what they simply critique as neoliberalism in Latin America or Eastern Europe. He does not include more complicated and subtle components. Another example, the electronic herd is a term he uses many times. The electronic herd is basically Wall Street traders, but not just traders. That's a more neutral term. The electronic herd implies that they have someone who gallops ahead in some way. Nobody really knows if it's because that leader is smarter or just happened to do it first, but that millions of other people follow by buying a stock or selling a currency in the manner that has no sense. Okay, in a sense, it's an attack on rationality. I'm not defending a pure rational market in any way, but I'm simply saying that these are labels that he invokes and uses as interpretive devices, even if he's saying he's not doing any theory. The next big point when he says the world is flat, does he, and he qualifies this as he goes on, but it's one of the first things which everybody asks and may have come to your minds. Does he really mean, and how many of you feel intuitively that this includes the whole world? Is the whole world really flat? And what, okay. And anybody want to comment a little bit on that idea? He took it from an Indian computer leader who was very successful. And so he has many anecdotes from India and from China, two of the largest countries in the world in terms of population. Are India and China today, or even more, 10 or 30 years ago, world leaders in having, an impact, let's say, or having millions and millions of people acting in the same way as his grandmother? No. So when he himself was even asked by critics and saying, I mean, how can you say the whole world is flat when you've got people who are illiterate, who can't read, write, don't use cell phones or whatever, or how can you expect them to be contracting out or doing business with people on Wall Street or the McDonald's Corporation? And what was his answer? What do you think his answer would be? Oh, of course not. I'm only talking about maybe 5% of China and maybe 5% of India. So he's ignoring 95% of China and India when he says the world is flat, roughly. That number might have changed, because within China and India today, the numbers of people simply at least owning or having access to a cell phone has gone from maybe 5 or 10% to something like 60 plus 70%, changes all the time as you have cheaper and cheaper and more powerful cell phones. But the simple point is the world is not literally flat, and a counter argument or counter image has been developed by others who talk about the world is spiky. We have spikes. We have narrow, very, very elitist centers of excellence. And the most obvious examples are the research universities in places like Oxford, Cambridge, Ann Arbor, Berkeley, Cambridge, Stanford, University of Chicago, and so forth in Chicago. These are centers, if you look at, say, the number of innovations, the number of patents, then the amount of people who are doing scientific papers, their citations, high quality students in universities, these are spiky. Talent gravitates to these and does not go equally in a flat manner. So even if there may be much higher concentration around computers, and that you have these globalizing processes, they by no means are equal, certainly to the degree to which we have this, as I talked about in the first two sessions, huge increase in egalitarianism, and second, the moral label that we should be all more literally equal. for sure that does not apply to the Friedman ideas as they're implemented in playing cards or all aspects of work. They really much, when we get to the more complicated aspects of it, which he especially gets into with contracting out, say, of reading x-rays from hospitals and having a radiologist in India read a Northwestern University hospital report and send it back, within an hour. I mean, that happens now. That kind of thing does not happen with average persons. These are smart MDs in India who are doing this. And these are, a small minority of the Indian population. Okay, so those are some of the big points, the big strengths as well as the weaknesses. But in terms of spreading the idea and beginning to encourage people to think about what is globalization, how does it work, Friedman had a huge impact. However, he left vague what it might be, and let's, for this purpose, if we could, if it's easy for you, so when Mio or whoever's doing this to show us the Herman Boschkin section, and I can look at it on my machine too, but is it easy for you to bring it up there? It's on, let me go back to this is on page 8. It starts on page 8 of the Boschkin paper. This is right on, let's just scroll through these types of globalization or definitions of what he calls 7 distinct dimensions. Okay, number 1, the large monocentric urban area. And this is getting to local, links between local and global here. So big cities tend to be more global. Monocentric simply says that they have one downtown rather than 5 or 6 or 7 down. So in that sense, LA is not really as monocentric as New York or Chicago or London or Paris. Okay, although those cities are also getting more polycentric with their suburbs. Okay, number 2, let's just scroll on down. Oop. Command Center for the Global Economy. Okay, this is close to Lenin. And it's a term taken in part, I mean, it's put together, but it's stressed by Saskia Sassen. The idea is that the global economy is dominated by corporations, and that the corporations have production services like accounting firms and law firms, and especially big corporate headquarters that hire or fire these accounting firms and law firms. And in that sense, Detroit for automobiles or New York for Wall Street and its related firms is a command center for the global economy, which is, you could say in a sense, is why the Twin Towers were destroyed, because they were such visible symbols of the command center of the global economy. Okay, so in a sense, that's a second conception which and he cites here Thomas Friedman or Friedman and Wolf. They basically, and as well as Sassen, but this came from Lenin. That's sort of the Lenin Marxist kind of corporate domination. Let's scroll on to number 3. Okay, global entertainment machine. Okay, here the idea is not just to focus on the share price of a Wall Street stock, but to say, how about social media? How about downloading music? How about playing bridge with a friend or someone who you met in Siberia? This entertainment is a different dependent variable. It's not what you have in your pocketbook in money or actually I'm pointing that out ironically to say you don't have this in your pocketbook anymore. You have it online usually. Okay, we'll talk about that more as we proceed. But the the idea that globalization is not just, and both is a dependent variable of what people are doing, like playing bridge or downloading films, but also the drivers of what makes people want to participate in this global world, the things which draw them into buying things at Amazon. You're more comfortable ordering some eyeglasses from Amazon or flour from Amazon if you've already been playing bridge with a friend in, or someone you got to know, became friends with in Siberia. Okay, let's go on to number 4. 4 is the World Center for Research. Okay, this goes back for centuries, that let's say historically the earliest universities were not in small towns, or in places like Paris and Berlin, but then with Oxford and Cambridge, and then all the more in the American Jeffersonian era and the land grant creation of universities, the American ideal of Thomas Jefferson specifically, that cities are corrupting. They're bad for politics and they're bad for students to grow up in, and therefore we should give grants and create our leading universities in small rural areas far away from the big cities. And so the land grants were made that you could have a state capital, or we'll give you money, we'll give you a land grant for building a railroad. And so these happened in the 19th century. And so places like Austin, Texas, Madison, Wisconsin, Urbana, Champaign, and so forth, these small towns. And in fact, it was in Urbana that some smart engineers invented Netscape, which he talked about. Its name was soon bought out and then lost as it was taken over by others. But it was really, that is the idea, the idea of having a program which could capture this stuff, and you could, in a simple way, just click with a mouse and do things the way you can now do on Firefox or Safari or Explorer. These things happen. These are all the grandchildren of the Netscape program. But without that kind of common language, this wouldn't have happened so easily. But the more important point is that in places like, I should not say Chicago, I should say Hyde Park. Hyde Park in that sense is more analogous to Berkeley and Hyde Park is in many ways a semi-closed village. Used to be much more so, but it's a closed village in that it feels, many of you or many of the faculty and students will live here and will say, oh, no, don't go to surrounding neighborhoods, stay right here. But think, write, communicate, send back and forth to and from everybody in the world. And so in that sense, we are a globally connected village. As research has been inherently much more global, not just national, for centuries. There's national competition, there's university competition, there's individual competition for sure, but the competition is not just with the people down the hall or in your own village. The competition is anywhere anybody else comes up with a better idea. So it may take a while for those better ideas to percolate and get generalized, but the idea of research in a global manner, the disciplines of physics, the emergence of professional associations like the associations of physicists that would meet every year and argue we're critical in this regard. Okay, number 5. Global Center of Multicultural Exchange, very close to the last thinking of not just Hyde Park, but in that sense, Hyde Park fits. That is not just the abstract physics papers, but people who are smart young physicists coming here from China, coming here from Argentina. You as students get to know each other and get to know through more advanced students, grad students, laboratories, and you're talking to one another is a major kind of building of a perspective of globalization, which is totally different from Wall Street, or totally different from just playing cards with one person. 6, International Transport Gateway. This is the older idea of things like rivers, railroads, a global airport, and so forth were critical for making the a city be a center of trade or transportation, beyond transportation, that led people to think in terms of a broader set of connections. So the idea of networks or connectivity fits with this. And of course, it's more physical than the more abstract things like monies or stock market shares. 7. All right, so this is perhaps lower and more physical as well. Rail mass transit infrastructure. So having in the late 19th century the emergence of railroads certainly took this further, the analog stressed more by Thomas Friedman, for example, is having the wired world globally through cables which go to India, to China, and connect Argentina to India and China. So in that sense, even though many of the corporations which installed those global cables went bankrupt or were bought out, they left an infrastructure which was and is a foundation on which we are building for all kinds of things which can flow over those cables. So the cables of the railroads don't tell us anything about the content. In that sense, putting these seven components together gives us a different perspective. So I don't propose that you memorize and say these are the golden 7. On the contrary, what they do is is to break away from the idea that Wall Street is globalization. That's the too simple stereotype that we want to go beyond. Okay, let's see. Let me push on then to. I'll ask if I'll hold up my copy. If we could get rid of that on your screen and let me hold this up, unless any of you found this on the web. No, okay, let me just use my version. All right, this is a simple way to show you a summary of Saskia Sassen. One thing she did, that is one of her most original ideas in the book, that is, or let me back up and say, the main idea of the book is Adam Smith. It's no different than Adam Smith. The wealth of nations comes from global cities. Global cities make bigger deals. The further they go, the more money they make. And those cities, and especially the Wall Street area in New York, people make more money. And the people who make the most money are those who have the most distant and numerous connections, like Wall Street investors, accountants, lawyers, and corporate advisors that work with them. In contrast to people who migrate in from Jamaica or Ecuador or Mexico, who are chauffeurs or housemaids or janitors. So her stress is that New York has increased income inequality, and that her general idea is number one up here: globalization leads to greater inequality. That's the key idea, which in a sense she took more from Lenin than she did from Adam Smith. So she's combined multiple dimensions from different people. She doesn't cite any of these people. She just puts them all in together. Okay, and that's what has led many people to read Saasen. Is she presents us with both a sort of scientific aura, but a moralistic criticism combined with it. The second line, number 2 here, globalization may lead or might lead to inequality, but it also leads to anti-inequality policies, such as the so-called welfare state of unemployment insurance. That is, if the government will give you a check, and under COVID, some people were getting checks twice as large as they were earning while they were employed. By being unemployed, they doubled their incomes. Okay, that kind of anti-inequality policy is a government response to the first step. So it's A leads to B leads to C. Okay, the third line here is maybe a little harder to read. I'll put it up here and see if we can see this. Okay, we got 2 lines here, really 3 lines, A, B, a little A, a little B, a little C. So globalization can lead to little A, a little B, a little C. Let me look at them and see here. This is a box and arrow. I'm trying to give you a simple version of a quick version of the ideas. This is not in Saasen. These are critiques now of Saasen. So I'm summarizing a whole lot of criticisms. Path A is knowledge and adaptation of strengthening, especially for left parties, that as they grow more aware of globalization and its negatives, they can criticize the potentials of inequality and generate more votes. I add quickly in parentheses, I'll ask anybody who's looked at the book, does Saasen talk about the electoral system, politics, elections, video, voting, parties, anything like that? No, not a word in this book. This book is entirely economic, technological, hierarchical, and there's no counter to these processes by the political system. So most of these alternative paths come from the political system. So path A is parties and actual policies. Path B is anti-inequality policies and discussions, which people then have in their minds. Path C is other variables. Other variables is big. That is, lots of other things are going on, and you came up with many other variables, like the shared currency or other things which are going on there. And that in turn can really be a theory 4 that Saasen is in part spurious, or her rhetoric her book is really rhetorical, in the sense that it's an essay about how things seem to work in her mind. She has a number of tables, but she really doesn't have any multi-causal analysis. She has some tables which sort of look as if they fit her rhetoric, but she's not really testing any coherent theory. Okay, so that is, she does not have what I've shown here as 4 alternative paths, which someone might say, I'll try to test these. And that was in fact done by Xing Xiong, who was a student from China. She did an MA she did a seminar with me and Saskia. And she did an MA, and she didn't just take New York and said, this is America. She looked at all of the metro areas in the US, and she calculated measures of income inequality as a dependent variable. Then she said, what are the factors which lead to more income inequality across all the metro areas in the US? And she tested first foreign direct investment as a sort of capital investment measure, and that was positive. So those cities, those metro areas with more foreign direct investment did have more income inequality. Second, they had more migration, that more people were migrating to them, and that was, she didn't try to say what was causality, but she said that clearly was in both of these findings, but that this was associated with more inequality. The third factor stressed here from Saassen was the idea that producer services as measures of as measures of the extent of these as a percentage of the economy, the workforce. Do you have a lot of people in places like what used to be Arthur Andersen in Chicago or Deloitte, big accounting firms, big law firms? Chicago has tons of these. Chicago is much more attractive, but these are not identical with the size of corporations or population or other things. So producer services, she found, was spurious. That is, Saassen was wrong. So she then, we talked about it with Saskia and said, hey, Saskia, you know, we got some interesting findings here. Why don't we publish them? We're testing your ideas. And Saassen wrote, she wasn't too enthusiastic, but it went ahead. And so we published it in English and French. But simultaneously, there was a guy in London. He had a little more blatant title. Can you read that? Okay. His basic answer was more like my path diagrams, and his argument why Saassen was wrong was that she was wrong because she left out the welfare state and welfare related government policies which could constrain or reverse the processes of inequality which went on in Saassen's theorizing, and which are indeed, the data show, higher. That is, there is more inequality in New York than in London, and more in London than in Tokyo. But Saassen doesn't deal with that kind of comparison of why we have degrees of this. But the bottom line is producer services are not the driver. The other follow-up reading just below her paper is Jeroen van der Walle, Unraveling the Global City Debate. This was a brilliant PhD. I was on the committee in Rotterdam, and he reviewed the work by the English. Chris Hamnett was the author of this. He did about six or so careful studies and papers, and this is a synthesis of them based on the welfare state patterns within London and within all of the UK. What he did was to review the theorizing of Saassen very tightly and point out the kinds of things which I laid out in these boxes and arrows, that Saassen doesn't really have a coherent theory. It's too messy to test. You're not presented with ways of saying how strong is this path. And so he builds a much more tight, coherent framework first. Second, he then tests it, or then the second factor he includes is those from Hamnett, which is the idea of the welfare state and producer services. And he shows that he then gets a small, medium-sized data set, and shows that these were basically insignificant, which is the same finding as the Chinese student here had, Xing Zhong. The third thing he then tested was, what were the values and attitudes of the people in different cities, and were the workers in those cities and in those companies welcoming and encouraging foreigners or not? And he found that, and this is especially Dutch, even though the Netherlands we know of and is generally a highly, highly tolerant, egalitarian, moralistically generous country, they have some degree of how actively or less actively do they welcome foreigners. And the basic finding was, the more active that foreigners are the more actively that foreigners are welcomed, the less income inequality there is in a city. So in that sense, and this is something which Sasson never mentioned. So, but it fits with these other variables which I showed as the fourth path. Okay, let me stop there as I've given you a quick overview of the main readings in the section and launched with linking to your own thoughtful ideas, which are a great base to build on. Questions and comments? 5 minutes left. Some of you are even doing more serious work on this in other courses. Anybody want to bring in anything in another course that links to any of this? Gustavo, I remember your topic overlaps broadly, but can you remind us of what you're studying for your, that you mentioned to us before?
Oh yes, my BA thesis is about Brazilian evangelicals, particularly Pentecostals, and their role in right-wing radicalization in Brazil, which led to the election of Bolsonaro in 2018.
Okay. Is that salient in most of what I talked about today? No. So in a sense, I mean, you could loosely, well, you could say it's connected with some of these paths, and it could be an other variable down here that Brazil is acting, or let's say different actors within Brazil are taking a different perspective on globalization, driven by things which are not simply Wall Street. But there's been a lot of discussion inside the US, in Korea, and of course in Brazil and Argentina about the evangelicals as major political drivers. And that they've crystallized in some of the anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant rhetoric and activities. And so that Donald Trump's anti-immigrant style grows out of a tradition of some of this in the US, which has had an evangelical base. The best analysis, I would say, or the best earlier analysis with a focus more on the broader evangelicals historically is by Robert Putnam's in his book called American Grace. But there's some newer work that we're going to talk about next week, which I want to, we may add, well, if we don't get it onto the reading list, we'll talk about it. But there's some new work which is getting at these issues as how these, that is, not to deny the importance of money or trade, which goes back for centuries, but what Friedman then talked about right at the beginning, this is related to the state and to invasions and to the British Empire and to evangelicals. Okay, so let me not talk further on this. Simply keeping in mind that there are other things going on which make these things which we've talked about mostly in this section. So that is, we're trying to deal with the core ideas. Let me go back to the heading. Economics, technology, hierarchy. We've talked more about economics and technology. We haven't talked so much about hierarchy except as the command center of the global economy idea, or the debated term now of big tech is being attacked in the American press and the Europeans. In a sense, that's the opposite of the Thomas Friedman argument that we didn't get to it very much, but it's in his book if you want to read on. he stresses the degree to which countries and corporations are big, big drivers. Individuals like his grandmother are one person at a time. And a lot, but what he doesn't include there are things between one person and something a little bit bigger, like a university or a research department or 5 people who work and study together on an experiment. Even if you have a big corporation like Microsoft, it's not one, everybody at Microsoft doesn't want, they have thousands of projects or hundreds of different projects. And the people who are active may be 2, 3, 5, 7. It's little numbers like that. And this is what Friedman stresses, and this grows out of the sociology of science, history of science, many other studies by others, same kind of thing. These kinds of small groups are really the critical, they're called the invisible colleges in some writings. The invisible colleges are not all of the University of Chicago. There's 6 people working together in France, China, South Africa, and Norway, who together publish a paper. Okay, read on, think about read some of the commentaries as well in the syllabus where we discuss these kinds of points. We want to be able to use markets and remember that they're there. At the same time, there's lots of discussion about where and why they're eclipsed, they're transformed, they're weakened and strengthened by other factors, and it's those other things that we want to pay attention to as we proceed. So we'll do that next week with the social media, and we'll link more to what's happening this day and this week in the US, Washington, and so forth. But do read on, and we look. Oh, do we have a hand up from Ram? Or is that, maybe that's not a hand up? It's just a different kind of symbol, I guess. Okay.
Sorry, Professor. I have a question.
Okay.
About. I'm sorry. I have a question about the golden straight jacket and Thomas Ferdinandus, and
Sure.
I just want to know like what exactly it is, because I feel like I did not understand that.
Sure. Yeah, my 2-sentence sort of version is it's the ideology that we could call neoliberalism, and which that term is widely used as a narrow economic driver. And it implicitly says for people, I said, in Eastern Europe and Latin America, that you've got to follow the precepts of international trade laid down by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and you need to follow those principles if you want to prosper, and you are a country like Chile or Indonesia or China. And that so in a sense it's a political program which Friedman simplifies, I would say, by calling it a golden straitjacket. It says you'll get rich and you'll have gold on your as your clothes, but at the same time it constrains you. You can't do cartwheels, you can't jump on a skateboard as well with wearing a golden straitjacket as if you wore something else. That's the quick idea. So for the specific content, he does discuss some of that in the book, and as do others that we'll read about as we proceed. But take a look at that and some of the related the propositions in the discussion and propositions in the syllabus also get to some of these ideas, even though that term is not used. In a sense, you could say it's the idea that the free market should dominate, and the institutions surrounding the free market should be supported, and we should suppress things which try to control the very free workings of markets. That's the kind of idea.
Okay, thank you. I got it.
Very good. Okay, we will continue with office hours for a bit now. You can hang up if you want, but feel free to stay on if you have other questions you want to discuss with us.